The real cause of crime is poverty, ignorance, hard luck. When we look at the prisoners in the jails, we find that all of them practically are poor, at least 9/10, and these have always been poor.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the first legal video on Magical History Tour. For you see, the law and trials have been in the news recently, haven't they? And with the recent verdict of an ex-president being met, I thought now would be a good time to do a video about a book I'm reading, Clarence Darrow, Attorney for the Damned. Now, Darrow was a famous defense attorney during the late 19th and early 20th century. Perhaps the trial you remember him for in history class was the Scopes monkey trial, where he defended the teacher John Scopes' right to teach evolution in Tennessee. Well, Darrow took on plenty of other rather unpopular cases in his time as a lawyer. He was overall a very interesting person, a free thinker, a womanizer, and above all, a legendary lawyer. So let's talk about Clarence Darrow, a Clarence who had a very different political philosophy than this Clarence. On with our feature presentation. Clarence Seward Darrow was born on April 18, 1857 in Farmdale, Ohio. His middle name Seward is important as his father Amyras named him after one of his political idols, William Seward. He was the famous abolitionist and later Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln, and that is where Clarence got his middle name. Clarence grew up in a small town where his father was somewhat of an outcast for his lack of religious beliefs. They called Amyras the town infidel for a reason. He had a strong willingness to stand up to institutions, and he passed this on to his son Clarence. His mother Emily had progressive views as well. She was an early advocate of women's suffrage. Now, while Clarence grew up in Ohio and was raised by progressive parents, the Darrow family had strong roots in colonial America, particularly New England. His parents took on sort of a puritanical attitude towards raising him, and Clarence would struggle with feeling loved the rest of his life, particularly after Emily died when he was a teenager. Clarence would later move to Chicago as a young lawyer as he felt the tiny Ohio towns were holding him back. What did he do during this time? Well, in his late 20s and early 30s, he was working for the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad Company. Basically, there were a lot of fatal railroad accidents in Chicago at this time, and when someone raised a fuss about it in court, Darrow's job was to reduce the settlement money that they got. Doesn't seem like the whole defender of the underdog image that Clarence is known for, but this was his earlier adult life, as he settled in with his first wife, Jessie. But, again, it was a largely unhappy marriage. Though they had a son named Paul, Clarence never felt intellectually stimulated in his marriage to Jessie. People married quickly back in those days, and this was the norm for old Clarence, too. He would eventually divorce and pay alimony to Jessie for most of the rest of his life, and made sure that his son Paul was taken care of, too. But the book here mentions that he felt he fell short as a father and never had quite a close relationship with his son. In any case, it was 1893 when Darrow's boss, William C. Goody, collapsed and died. Darrow's conscience was already hurting him for the work he had done, and the loss of his boss basically meant that this was the signal that his work needed to change. From here on out, he would be hanging mostly around progressive circles and being the attorney for the damned. Darrow's first high-profile case was helping out anarchist Patrick Prendergast. He assassinated Chicago Mayor Carter Harrison, a man whom Darrow actually worked for. And yet, here was Darrow saying, "Let's not rush to judgment." Said Darrow on Prendergast, "Most men admit that the prisoner was insane, and yet lawyers, doctors, merchants, and men of all classes are almost unanimous in saying that, whether sane or insane, the wretched being ought to hang." Perhaps you're familiar with Charles Guiteau and the assassination of President James Garfield. Well, this is a similar case. Prendergast was a delusional office seeker. He was indeed insane, and that was the defense Darrow used when representing him. But much like Guiteau, the court did not find the insanity defense compelling, and Prendergast met the noose. Darrow did not witness the hanging as he was far too disheartened and sad by losing his first important case. But little did anyone know that out of all the murderers and other shady people that Darrow would later go on to defend in the decades that followed, Prendergast was the only one to meet the death penalty. For you see, Darrow would go on to become a master in courtroom tactics when representing troubled people. One case that particularly stood out to me was how he represented a 13-year-old boy named Thomas Crosby, who murdered a sheriff named Frank Nye. The boy's family was desperately poor and were constantly fearing eviction. Someone would always be guarding the door, with the aim being to shoot the sheriff dead whenever he came to inevitably evict the broke family. Well, that 13-year-old boy did what he was instructed to do, and in order to build up some sympathy, and perhaps even shock the jury a bit, Darrow gave them a complete bluff. He basically said, "Rather than you guys send this boy to some juvenile detention center or jail or whatever, I dare you to send him to the gallows. I dare you." The bluff worked, and Darrow got the boy off scot-free. His mother was convicted of manslaughter, but Darrow appealed and got the conviction thrown out. Another case of Darrow representing the underdog was coming to Pennsylvania to represent underpaid coal workers. He abandoned political ambitions and his law firm in his home city of Chicago to do this. In any case, he represented both coal miners and the somewhat notorious socialist Eugene V. Debs, which earned him a reputation as a friend of labor. Some would even say that Darrow's somewhat disheveled appearance in court was a nod to the folks he represented, as his hair was never quite straight. Disheveled haircuts continue to be a trend with more progressive, labor-friendly politicians, but that's beside the point, I suppose. Darrow claimed he won the coal miners a raise of $8 million and $3 million in back pay. This 10% raise overall, along with reducing hours to 8 or 9 per day depending on the man's duties, was a great victory for labor. So how did Darrow win over the juries here? He used more ways of manipulating their emotions, telling these stories of danger and death in the coal mines. This was dangerous, potentially life-threatening work, so maybe the miners deserve a bit more money, no? Another side to Darrow was his knack for womanizing, particularly after his divorce with Jessie. He was into the free love movement at this point, which essentially said that marriage is a stupid idea and you could have as many lovers as you wish. Young feminists of this era that he chased after embraced the free love movement too, rejecting the typical Victorian ideals of the day and age. They felt marriage was repressive, that marriage meant possession by the man. Indeed, Darrow felt that it restrained both men and women, and he took comfort in the intellectual company of women, and definitely also the physical comfort too. Indeed, he wrote to his friend, Mary, that sex is the only feeling in the world that can make you forget for a while, and he relied on women to escape what he called an emptiness. During his bachelor years and after divorcing Jessie, there was a story of him reading aloud to multiple women nestled up to him. Yes, Darrow had found intellectual equals by this point. But alas, his mini harem of sorts was disappointed at the news of 1903 when he had settled on a new wife named Ruby. She was described as fashionable and smart enough to land Clarence as well. Clarence had surrendered yet again to the institution of marriage, but the thing was, his life as a free lover didn't quite end there. Nor did his life as a lawyer representing shady people, and indeed perhaps the most notorious people he represented were the McNamara brothers. This got Darrow into some deep trouble, the kind that very nearly put him in jail. It all started when John and James McNamara, two pro-union radicals, blew up the Los Angeles Times building with dynamite. The Times was an anti-union newspaper in LA, and the time was 1:07 in the morning when writers there were working on stories for the next day. The explosion killed 21 people and injured 100 more. This remains the deadliest crime to go to trial in the history of California, and who else but Clarence Darrow took on the defense case of the McNamaras. He was essentially pressured by organized labor to take on their case. He wasn't completely convinced of the McNamara's innocence, or certainly not of any way to prove it or argue it, so he resorted to bribing jurors. Maybe I can buy my clients their innocence, he figured. But also around this time he was doing the bribing, he secured the McNamara's a plea deal. James pled guilty to planning the bomb and was sentenced to a lifetime in jail. John was sentenced to 15 years in jail for a completely separate incident. In any case, Darrow spared them their necks. But at what cost? The cost would be the legal system going after him not once but twice for bribing jurors. In the first case, he got a unanimous verdict proclaiming his innocence, with the successful defense being, did the prosecution truly prove Darrow bribed a juror? And even if he did, it was deemed to be after the plea deal with the McNamara's was already discussed. Darrow himself never felt mentally guilty about the case, basically thinking to myself, if I can save someone's neck and help organized labor, it's worth bribing a juror. The second case against Darrow was a lot bumpier because of Darrow's logic. Indeed, when he spoke up to defend himself, he took a big risk by essentially saying, the McNamara's aren't morally guilty of any crime. Considering 21 people died, the jury had a tough time dealing with that argument, and 8 out of 12 wanted conviction, but 4 still refused, citing a lack of evidence against Darrow. Well, with it being a hung jury, Darrow barely escaped conviction, and he returned to Chicago somewhat disgraced. Darrow would recover his image and conclude his career with 2 of the most high-profile cases of the 20th century. In 1924, Darrow took on the case of another pair of young killers, Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb. They had kidnapped and killed 14-year-old Bobby Franks. Leopold and Loeb were both wealthy and well-educated, leading many in the public to wonder, how could they commit such an atrocious act? Well, apparently they did it for the thrill of it. Darrow again used an insanity defense of sorts for the young men, using witnesses in the psychiatric field to say that they had no sense of emotional regulation. Darrow also emphasized that in a way, these were not men, they were just boys. And the days where 21 was the age of majority, the 19-year-old Leopold and 18-year-old Loeb were indeed considered minors. Remember, this was before the Vietnam War. So really, as Darrow often did throughout his career, he was just trying to spare his clients' necks. And after a 12-hour closing argument, he did just that. His boys got life in prison, but were spared from the gallows. And Darrow's last and most famous hurrah was the Scopes monkey trial against who else but William Jennings Bryan. We talked about him in our last video as a 3-time presidential loser back then, someone who ran on progressive platforms. Darrow did have sympathies towards the Democratic Party and Bryan, especially in that 1896 election. But Bryan was a young man back in those days, only 36 and running for president, and Darrow thought him rather stupid. There was a fiery exchange between them that would set the stage for the monkey trial 3 decades later. Darrow told Bryan, "You'd better study science, history, philosophy, and quit this village religious stuff." Bryan replied, "Darrow's the only man in the world who looks down on me for believing in God." Darrow replied, "You're kind of a god." And so this debate over religion carried over to biology teacher John Scopes of Tennessee. He challenged a Tennessee law that said you couldn't teach anything that goes against creationism, daring to teach evolution in a southern state. Because the case was about evolution and there was the whole idea of humans and monkeys having a common ancestor, it got the nickname the Monkey Trial. The penalty for Scopes wouldn't be the kind of permanently life-changing or life-ending sentences that many of Darrow's clients faced. It would be a $100 fine. And yet the nation was wrapped by the arguments made by Darrow and Bryan for or against this man. Although the most famous exchange Darrow made in this case did more to make Bryan look like a fool than to defend his client Scopes. After all, Bryan was brought on as an expert witness on the Bible. Said Darrow to Bryan, "Do you claim that everything in the Bible should be literally interpreted?" And Bryan replied, "I believe that everything in the Bible should be accepted as it is given there. Some of the Bible is given illustratively. For instance, "Ye are the salt of the earth." I would not insist that man was actually salt or that he had flesh of salt, but it is used in the sense of salt as saving God's people. Well, this whole exchange, despite winning public favor for Darrow, didn't do anything, as it was expunged from the record. After all, it didn't have anything to do with Scopes teaching evolution or not, and since it was against the law to do so, he was declared guilty. But he wouldn't have to pay his $100 fine off of a technicality, although it wasn't on constitutional grounds as Darrow had hoped. So overall, although his client lost, Darrow got to have a last laugh of sorts against his old arch-rival in the Democratic Party. The monkey trial was Darrow's last big case, and he'd pass away in 1938 at the age of 80. The fact that the monkey trial is what Darrow is remembered for in the history books definitely gives him a lasting legacy as a free thinker. Indeed, a few years later in 1929, he'd give the speech "Why I Am an Agnostic" in a public symposium about belief. There were other folks there who gave speeches about why they were a Catholic, a Protestant, or a Jew, but Darrow's speech essentially held that, at least in the Western world, to be an agnostic was to doubt the Christian God that much of society believed in. The way he framed it was interesting, though, saying that Protestants are agnostic on Catholicism and Catholics are agnostic on Protestantism. His argument basically being that every human has their doubts, we agnostics just doubt everything. He concluded his speech by saying, "Skepticism and doubt lead to study and investigation investigation is the beginning of wisdom." So let's remember Darrow in the spirit of free thinking. He was certainly a man of faults, an adulterer, a person who bribed a jury at one point, but now let's conclude the video with another word from Darrow about the prohibition of his time period, and let's think of how this applies to our current criminal justice system, except instead with drugs.
Mr. Darrow, in your opinion, what is the reason for the increase of crime in this country?
I don't know whether there's an increase of crime or not. That's a question which can't well be answered. We do know that there's an increase in the population of our prisons, and a very decided one. For instance, 1/4 of all the people in our federal prisons are there for selling liquor.